Good morning. My name is Molly Fogarty, and I lead Nestlé's U.S. Corporate and Government Affairs Group. My team plays a critical role in Nestlé's pursuit of sustainable business operations. I wanted to start by thanking the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for convening this event and inviting me to speak. It's truly humbling to share the virtual stage with such a distinguished group of speakers. Whether you're attending as an NGO, public official, or business leader, we're all aware of the role our oceans play as the largest store of carbon in regulating global climate and weather patterns. Nestlé is the largest food and beverage company in the world. We're acutely aware of the current and future risks related to climate change on our raw material and supply chains. That's why the fight to mitigate climate change is critical for Nestlé, and why we've committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The environmental challenges we're facing are unprecedented and interconnected. Changes to our climate can seem small if we measure in degrees of temperature rise, but as this group is aware, the present and future impacts our oceans, our coastlines, agricultural lands, and raw material supply chains can be dramatic. Nestlé has the long-term view that building a resilient company in the future means protecting the planet today. We have a plan for our part to make that happen. At the brand level, we have initiatives underway to protect our oceans. Our Purina Beyond brand sources fish from fisheries that meet international best practices for sustainable fishing, earning the Marine Stewardship Council certification for our seafood-based pet food. And Poland Springs will soon be 100% recyclable across the entire brand, helping to keep our packaging in the marketplace and not in oceans. At the highest level, Nestlé has embraced the most ambitious elements of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we plan to achieve zero net emissions by 2050. We'll do this by including more plant-based options in our portfolio, scaling up renewable energy in our operations, and developing agricultural initiatives for carbon storage, reforestation, and biodiversity protection. We're well on our way to meeting our goals. In 2019, our global emissions from operations fell by 34% compared to 2010, and renewable energy now fully powers 1/3 of our global factories. But we also need support from federal and state governments to reduce emissions. As the founding member of the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, we support a national carbon pricing system and a modern infrastructure to create a competitive energy market. Nestlé also supports the Paris Accord and the EPA's Clean Power Plan to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We'd like to see similar sweeping protective measures for our oceans too. Congress's passage of Save Our Seas 2.0 earlier this year is a step in the right direction, which we fully supported. While the passage of such legislation is encouraging, we need to see more bold actions, which is why Capitol Hill Ocean Week is such an important event. We believe it will take all of us, businesses, nonprofits, policymakers, customers, and voters to achieve a sustainable future. So as we kick off the day, I'll leave you with this. There are many different voices at the table, but we all share the same end goal, to protect our oceans and planet for generations to come. And we'll only get there by engaging one another and working together. Thank you for having me, for attending Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and I can't wait to hear today's discussion.
Hello, my name is Enric Sala. I am a National Geographic Explorer in Residence, and I dedicate my life to work with governments and communities to create marine protected areas around the world. And this is precisely what we are going to talk about today. Meaningful protection of the ocean. And there is nothing that protects ocean life. There is nothing that restores ocean life better than marine protected areas. But not any type of marine protected areas. Marine protected areas that allow some types of fishing are areas that are managed, but they are not truly protected. Fully protected areas, areas without fishing, drilling, mining, without destruction of the habitats, are truly what we need if we want to restore marine life. On average, the abundance, the biomass of fish inside these fully protected areas increases over 600% within their boundaries. And not only the fish are more abundant, but they are also larger, which means that they produce a disproportionately larger number of eggs, helping to replenish the fisheries around. I have dived in many fully protected areas around the world, and I have seen this miracle happen everywhere. Areas that are degraded come back to life spectacularly within a few years, and local fishermen start reaping the benefits in as fast as 3 or 5 years after protection. Also, diving tourism is a fantastic source of jobs and revenue in areas that are otherwise overfished and impoverished, because divers want to go where they can see fish. When the fish come back, the divers come in, bringing huge revenue to local communities. So when we're talking about priorities, we need to prioritize areas that are truly providing the full suite of benefits, not only to the ocean, but also to people and the economy. The next question is, where should we place these areas? Of course, if we place a marine reserve in a place where nobody fishes because there is nothing there, that might not be the best place. And there is this conflict always between extraction and protection. But we have research from all around the world, and we have new research that clearly shows that protecting the right places around the ocean can not only help restore marine biodiversity, but it can also help boost fisheries worldwide and also help us mitigate climate change, because the ocean that is protected is able to absorb more of our carbon pollution. And our research shows that we need more than 30%, actually over 35% of the ocean. If that 35% of the ocean was strategically protected, the right 35% fully protected, we would not only preserve marine life that is unique and irreplaceable and is at risk from human activities, but also we would boost fisheries globally. The fisheries catch would increase. And also we would avoid carbon emissions that are caused by bottom trawling, which disturbs large amounts of carbon that are in the sediment on the seafloor that otherwise would be locked in the sediment forever. So this is the challenge. We need to go from the current 2.5% of the ocean that is fully protected to 35% by 2030. Can we do it? The science and the economics are clear, and some countries have already done it, like Chile, Palau, Seychelles, even the United States and the United Kingdom. But the United States has also another challenge. Most of the protection is in areas that are very remote, mostly in the Pacific, while less than 1% of the coasts along the US mainland are fully protected from our activities. If we want to use the ocean and obtain more benefits, that's what we need to do. That's why we are pushing for more than 30% of the ocean to be protected, fully protected from our activities, for the benefit of ocean life and also for the benefit of human society. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone to our panel discussion focused on defining priorities for meaningful protection. I'm Kathryn Mengerink, the Executive Director of the Waitt Institute, and I'm super excited to be here with this stellar group of panelists to talk about what meaningful protection means. The Waitt Institute works with government, scientists, and communities to focus on this very issue, achieving meaningful protection around the world. So I'm eager to learn from our group about their experiences and lessons. Let me just start with a little bit of an overview of how our session is going to run today. First of all, I'm going to give a very brief overview and introduce all of the panelists at one time, and then we'll turn it over to them to give short presentations, followed by a moderated discussion. I hope that you all enjoy the discussion as much as I am hoping to do as well. So first of all, Capitol Hill Oceans Week this year is focused on biodiversity. And our discussion today about marine protected areas will also target biodiversity and marine protection. As many of us know, 2020 has been marked by the United Nations as expressed under SDG 14 as the year that the world should achieve protection of at least 10% of the ocean. Today, we are around a little bit over 5% of the ocean that is protected and actively managed. So we have quite a ways to go just in 2020. And also there's growing interest and recognition that 10% isn't enough, and a growing effort to achieve 30% by 2030. So as a starting point, what do we mean by meaningful protection? Do we have a common set of standards that can guide us? Our first panelist, Dr. Kirsten Grorud-Colvert, will explore these questions and more. Dr. Colvert is an assistant professor at Oregon State University, where she studies ocean ecosystems and marine protection. She's also so she's the perfect person to talk to us about how do we define marine protected areas and what does that really mean. Another crucial issue is what to protect. What is the status of protection in the United States? Are we protecting the right things? Our second panelist today, Dr. Emmett Duffy, will help us answer these questions. Dr. Duffy is the director of the Smithsonian Marine Geo and Tennenbaum Marine Observatories Network, and he'll share with us the status of MPAs today and what more is needed to achieve meaningful protection. Capitol Hill Oceans Week is not just about the marine environment, it's also about the Great Lakes. And joining us, we have Dr. Doug Pearsall, a senior conservation scientist at the Nature Conservancy, who has spent his career supporting protective management of the Great Lakes. He'll talk to us about what the threats are to the Great Lakes, what strategies there are to address those threats, and what priority conservation areas exist for the Great Lakes. At the end of the day, meaningful protection is about people. It's about people who lead protection efforts, people who manage protected areas, and the people who have to comply with the rules and regulations in order for protection to be successful. Today we have Mrs. Vera Metcalf, who's the executive director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission, and is also the executive council member for the Inuit Polar Council. She's the perfect person to talk to us about the role of people and the environment, and she'll share with us the approach that the Inuit have taken, the role of indigenous knowledge managing the marine environment, how Alaska Native communities understand ecosystem health, and the role of communities in research. So as you can tell or hear, we have a really fabulous group of people to talk about defining priorities for meaningful protection. And with that, I will turn it over to Kirsten to lead us off.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thanks to Capitol Hill Ocean Week organizers for the invitation, and also to my fellow panel. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. I wanted to start off by talking about effective ocean protection and the reality that we really need multiple tools to be able to meet that goal. We'll need multiple tools, and among them today, we're going to focus on marine protected areas. So what is an MPA? It's a clearly defined geographical space. It's protected by legal or other effective means. And importantly, the primary goal is the conservation of nature. So, for example, other effective area-based conservation measures wouldn't apply here if conservation of biodiversity is not the primary goal. Now, MPAs are part of increasing commitments to ocean protection. Of course, in this 2020 super year for the ocean, we have the 10% target. And the question is, are we there yet? We have two challenges in answering that question. The first is that there are different views about how much of the ocean is protected. You may have heard different numbers cited as the percentage of the ocean that is currently protected. And that's because when we tally up an MPA and add it to the global number, it depends on when it's actually protected. The second challenge is that we don't know how much of that protection is effective. That depends on the type of MPA, the conditions around its design and establishment, and because different uses may be allowed or disallowed in an MPA, MPAs have different protection levels. Now, the good news is over the past decades, there are literally hundreds of scientific studies about MPAs, what we can expect for them, what we tend to see when an area is protected. We are part of a collaborative group developing what's called the MPA Guide as a shared language for ocean protection. So this is an initiative that involves a wide range of voices across government, science, NGOs, stakeholders, and the leading partners are listed there on the bottom. The goal of the MPA guide is to provide a system for clarity and transparency in how we track effective ocean protection. So it provides a stage of establishment of any given MPA. It groups MPAs according to their level of protection, and it links the likely outcomes that can be expected from an MPA based on that protection level. So, for example, the stages of establishment. There are many steps on the road to creating an MPA, and these can range across 4 categories. So, first, committed or announced, we might think of a dignitary being at a high level conference and signaling the intent to create an MPA. Designated is when that MPA is signed into law or other authoritative rule so that it's legally defensible. But the next stage, implemented, is when the regulations and the rules go on force in the water, and that's when protection truly starts. Active management is, of course, when there's monitoring, regular review to make sure that conservation goals are being met. Also, the level of protection of an MPA is important. Fully protected MPAs, for example, you may have heard referred to as marine reserves or no-take areas. These are areas where all destructive and extractive activities are prohibited. Highly protected areas are similar in that any use that does occur is so small to be minimal and negligible and still achieving high conservation benefits. As you start to add more and more activities and uses inside MPAs, you move on to protection levels that are more lightly and minimally. Now, science does tell us a lot about MPAs and the ecological outcomes, particularly for fully protected MPAs. So there are a range of different ecological benefits, from protecting biodiversity to providing spillover to fished areas, all the way through to potentially providing resistance and resilience in the face of a changing climate. We also know that when MPAs are effectively designed and implemented, they can have outcomes for human well-being as well. What this means is that when we put these levels of protection and stages of establishment on a grid like the one you see here, what we're really doing is moving towards the upper right. In order to be able to achieve conservation outcomes, these sites that are fully and highly protected and that are actually having protection active on the water in implemented and actively managed stages are the ones that are going to provide the greatest conservation outcomes. Now, establishment of MPAs has been increasing over the past decades, especially the last 2, and we know that we're making progress. As of right now, 8% of the ocean is in any type of MPA. 5% of the ocean is in implemented MPAs, and that means MPAs that are active and not just signed on paper. 2% is fully or highly protected. Consider the US context, 26% of our EEZ is in implemented MPAs of any type, and 23% is fully highly protected. Now, note that almost all of that is in the Pacific Islands. It's a significant amount. If we were to remove that, we have about 1% fully highly protected in US continental waters. So what does the future look like? We need a clear understanding of how much of the ocean is effectively protected, and that will help us assess what's still needed. For example, when we hear things like called for 30% by 2030. We need a clear accounting of protection that's actually happening on the water, not only paper parks, but also things that are happening actively and achieving conservation outcomes, and a clear accounting of all types of MPAs, particularly because the protection level matters, and we want to be able to assess how to achieve the greatest conservation outcomes for people and nature. So thank you. For more information about the MPA guide, please visit these resources.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, Dr. Emmett Duffy, to lead us in the next section.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'd like to come back to a fundamental question, which is why we're concerned about biodiversity in the first place. And we can answer that question from a moral or ethical responsibility to protect marine life, which is the basis of many of our cultural and spiritual identities. But biodiversity also has a lot of utilitarian benefits to us. Obvious ones include food and economic security. Having diverse fisheries provides a sort of stable portfolio, just as an investment portfolio does. We use natural products for medicines. Pristine natural environment provide tourism revenue, and so on. So the question is, how do we sustain that diversity and benefit from it? As Dr. Grorud-Colvert mentioned, a key tool that we have to do this is through protected areas. And we now have plenty of science to know that protected areas, when they're done right, have a strong benefit to biodiversity. When we fully restrict fishing from an area, we get more fish, bigger fish, more biomass of fish, often 400 to 600% more, and more species. That is, species of marine life that cannot survive in the face of fishing. So we know that protection works. We also know that protection of biodiversity often benefits people through the tourism revenues is one mode that I mentioned, but also spillover of fish from these reserves. That is, fishes that grow within the reserves and then move outward. So my favorite example of this comes from the area around the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, which was closed to fishing in 1963 to protect the Space Center. And since then has become a haven for recreational fisheries, providing 50 to 62% of the world record fish in several species there. Other studies have shown that in many cases, the spillover from these reserves actually makes up for some and sometimes all of the lost fishing opportunity from protecting that space. But we also know that not all protected areas are equal. And a synthesis of numerous studies worldwide has now shown that the most effective marine reserves have 5 characteristics. They are no take, that is no fishing, well enforced, old, large, and isolated by deep water. When you have all 5 of those characteristics together, we generally have much higher fish biomass, and especially biomass of large fishes, such as sharks and other species that don't do well elsewhere. And these have important particular roles in the ecosystem. So we can't do a lot to leverage the isolation or age of ecosystems, but what we can do to make them work, to make protection work better, is to use no-take approach and enforce it well. So how do we do that to ensure that the resources, the marine resources and life of the United States as a whole are protected as well as they can be? Well, the good news is that the US already has an extensive area of marine protected areas. And within our 19 marine ecoregions around the country, we are protecting 70 to over 80% of the habitat types, kinds of animals and plants, and processes that are considered important to sustain biodiversity. That's the good news. On the other hand, we still have work to do in that only 2 of those 19 ecoregions have more than 1% of their area that is in no-take reserves and therefore especially well protected. And we also have not good knowledge on the distributions of the key habitats and species around those reserves. And that's especially important in terms of making them climate proof, because species are beginning to move all through the ocean as a result of climate change. So in order to assess the degree of protection of biodiversity in US waters, we've embarked on a new project that is supported by the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation and the Lenfest Ocean Program that is building a science-based framework to protect US marine life. And the goal of this really is to provide the science that is needed to realize the dream, if you will, originally stated in President Clinton's executive order back in 2000 to develop a comprehensive science-based area network of protection for marine biodiversity in US waters. So we're doing that by we have assembled an international expert working group who can inform us on lessons learned from what has worked and what hasn't worked in other places, including the US states and other countries, for protection, conducting a quantitative spatial gap analysis of what we have, and using that to develop recommendations for marine biodiversity protection in US waters. And we hope to be finished with that process by December of 2020. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emmett, for providing us with an overview of what's protected so far and where you're headed with your research. And we look forward to seeing seeing the results of that. So we've heard so far from Kirsten about the types, what we need, or what does it mean to have a marine protected area. There are different types of protected areas, and there's different levels of implementation. We've heard from Emmett about what the status is so far in the United States of marine protection. We now will turn to Doug Pearsall to talk to us about the Great Lakes. With you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's my honor to join this panel and bring a perspective from the Great Lakes, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. As you may know, the Laurentian Great Lakes of North America comprise the largest freshwater system in the world, holding roughly 20% of the world's surface freshwater. It's a young system, having been around only since the last ice age, about 18,000 years, and in their current form, roughly 4,500 years. Even so, they support diverse offshore, nearshore, and coastal ecosystems and many endemic species. Yet over the last 200 years, human activities have altered the Great Lakes in some ways irreversibly, including conversion of large areas of Great Lakes watersheds and coasts to agriculture, urban, and industrial uses, and the pollution related to each of those sources. Historic overfishing and aquatic invasive species are additional stresses, and climate change exacerbates many of these other challenges. Fortunately, the Great Lakes community has come together in many ways to address these issues. As one example, 20 years ago, the Nature Conservancy and many partners identified priority conservation areas for freshwater biodiversity. The primary focus of this work was on inland watersheds, and we didn't really address the Great Lakes, so they remained essentially a gap, although coastal areas, islands, and some nearshore areas were included. More recently, biodiversity conservation strategies were developed for each of the Great Lakes. These strategies focused on specific aquatic and terrestrial systems and species, and assessed their health and identified challenges to biodiversity. Each plan identifies strategies such as protection and restoration to overcome these challenges. And each plan identified priority areas for conservation, though in different ways. So for example, the Lake Erie Biodiversity Conservation Strategy quantifies the condition and biodiversity significance of coastal wetlands to inform conservation actions. So what is the status of in-lake and coastal protection across the Great Lakes? Well, recently in 2017, a binational team of scientists and planners assessed the status of marine protected areas in the Great Lakes. Encouragingly, the in-lake areas comprise almost 19% of the total area in US waters. Though I want to draw your attention to the bottom row in this table. There is tremendous variation among lakes in the amount of in-lake protection, and there are also all those other caveats that Dr. Grorud-Colvert reminded us of in terms of measuring the effectiveness of MPAs. And in Lake Huron, that percentage is thanks to the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and Underwater Preserve, which alone covers about 2.7 million acres. That contrasts starkly with Lake Ontario with almost 0% protection. So this study looked at broad categories of protection, and in taking a closer look, using recent data from NOAA and the Great Lakes Aquatic Habitat Framework, I compared protection area among different types or designs of MPAs. And we see here that the top 3 design types in terms of area protected are entirely in lake and comprise roughly 87% of the total MPA area and roughly 16% of the US Great Lakes area. Though these types of MPAs are primarily focused on cultural resources such as shipwrecks, they undoubtedly also provide protection for biodiversity. So where to from here? Well, we've seen that MPAs within the Great Lakes meet Aichi targets at a basin-wide scale, but not for each lake. And we're uncertain about the effectiveness for biodiversity. Parker and others in 2017 identified a number of research gaps and opportunities for increasing the effectiveness of protection and our accountability to protection outcomes. I would add to their list that conservation of the Great Lakes would benefit by more specific shared objectives for biodiversity conservation and that these objectives be clearly stated in the lake-wide action and management plans for each lake that support the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Finally, biodiversity conservation will be most effective through improved collaboration, especially through the adoption of shared goals and shared accountability. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug, for sharing with us about the Great Lakes and its status so far. And next, we'll turn it over to Vera Metcalf, who will talk to us about the Inuit Experience. Vera.
Hello, distinguished presenters and guests, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of CHOW 2020. As you know, I live in Alaska, and my home on St. Lawrence Island sits in the middle of a major migration route for vast numbers of marine mammals, bowhead whales, other whales, walrus, all types of ice seals, and millions of seabirds and fish. This is a very large, immense migration, which includes the entire population of some species, and one that follows the sea ice retreat in spring and its expansion in the fall. So for thousands of years, my ancestors have harvested and thrived in this environment. Even when there were periodic climatic and environmental changes throughout the millennia, the variety and quantity of marine mammals have sustained us. As Arctic indigenous people, we cannot be separated from our environment and our natural resources. We are and always have been absolutely dependent on this intimate relationship with our environment and its gifts. So to be grounded in this dependent relationship is a cultural strength. If they are healthy, so are we. With incredibly fast environmental changes happening as obvious and fundamental as our sea ice condition, the impact on our world is profound. These changes are not just an interesting research project, they represent a seismic shift in the traditional rhythms of our communities. I would suggest that my home, the Bering Strait region, offers a clear example of the variety of threats to our waters. We have experienced oil wildlife, avian cholera, and other large die-offs of seabirds and harmful algal blooms. U.S. federal managers have declared multiple unusual mortality events. The most recent is for ice seals because of unusually large numbers of carcasses found along Alaskan shores. The collapsing Bering Sea, or the cold pool, threatens the traditional Arctic marine ecosystem, and of course the significant increase in vessel traffic through the narrow strait as the northern sea route opens also increases the likelihood of contamination and accidents. The need for protecting our marine waters are plenty. The Bering Strait is truly a crossroad. The waters from south to north and continents from east to west. Ours is an international maritime border between Alaska and the United States and Chukotka, Russia, where we absolutely share marine mammals that know no borders. We must maintain cross-border communication and exchanges despite the politics dividing us. Because not only do we share the same resources and risks, but we also have family, cultural connections to Chukotka. Our natural resources are theirs, their natural environment is ours, and we both depend on these for our well-being, nutritionally, economically, and culturally. I'd just like to end by reaffirming the role Alaskan Native Arctic Indigenous people have in respecting and properly considering the gifts given to us. As one of our late highly esteemed elders from the native village of Gamble, Winnie James, said while we were documenting our lessons, he said, they say to us, never give up on the hunting areas out there. Whatever may have happened to us, whether it be an accident or almost killed, we mustn't be discouraged. It is where our food comes from. So thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vera, for sharing with us a bit about the experience in Alaska and the Bering Sea in particular. So at this point in time, we've heard from all of our panelists. And what I'd like to do next is to have a conversation and start to ask some questions. And since we all can't be together and have a conversation in person, you're stuck with me asking the questions. But I think that we'll have a robust discussion with this great group. So one of the things that Vera mentioned at the end of her presentation was the issue of the importance of food security in Alaska and for the Alaska Native community. Kirsten, I'd like to start with you. As you described in your presentation, you talked about the role of marine protection, but what does this mean for human well-being? Can ocean protection address both biodiversity and human well-being? And do you have thoughts about that you can share with us?
Yeah, thanks for asking, especially when we think about the definition of an MPA. That's a great question. So when we talk about the biodiversity inside an MPA, obviously we're also talking about all the people that depend on that biodiversity, both in the local vicinity and even beyond. So when we talk about managing an MPA, we're talking about managing people and also managing resources, and all for a common good. Now, we know from the science that the goal is for an MPA to be effective, and what that effective MPA looks like Emmett was sharing also, means more and bigger fish that tend to spill over into areas. We also know that protected systems are more functioning ecosystems if they're more biodiverse. And so this is what all the things that an effective MPA is. All those things are of benefit to people. And we know that over the long term, those benefits tend to accrue. There was a recent study actually where a group of authors led by Natalie Ban pulled together a bunch of data on MPAs and human well-being. And what they saw is that these fully protected areas, if they're protected over the long term and if they're designed involving the local community, they tend to be really effective with positive human well-being outcomes. And so we think about those being community involvement, protection of livelihoods over the long term. So this idea of biological conservation, biodiversity conservation, is really inherently linked to the benefits it provides to people.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsten. And that's a nice tee up for another question to Vera. And you mentioned, Kirsten, the role or the importance of the community in engaging in marine protection. And I think that Alaska provides a great example of the role of the Alaska Native communities in decision-making and management. Vera, could you talk to us a little bit about the role of Inuit communities in managing marine resources?
Yeah, well, good question. As I mentioned earlier, the well-being of our people and communities is absolutely dependent on the health of our entire ecosystem. We cannot be separated from the natural world. So I would say that we are completely entwined instead of intersected. As an example of the role for Inuit communities, I offer this idea. Like all indigenous people, I suppose I believe that my homeland and waters are the most wondrous, special, and sacred places on earth. Perhaps President Obama caught a glimpse of this when he established, by executive order, the Northern Bering Sea. climate resilience area. Even though it was rescinded, I would suggest the reason for creating it remains, which is to involve the region's communities in decisions directly affecting the health of the communities and the environment, and to conserve Arctic biodiversity by engaging Alaska Native tribes or in partnership with communities and agencies, the state of Alaska, to protect the marine mammals, the fish, seabirds, and other wildlife.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vera. I'll turn the next question over to Emmett. We've talked about the protection in the United States, the current state of, and noted that most areas have less than 1% protected, or just over 1%. And my question for you is, understanding that you haven't completed your analysis yet, but do you have some insight you can share with us about where you think the most crucial areas are for protection? And do we have some easy targets that we should all be focused on?
Well, the short answer is I want to emphasize first that the U.S. has made major progress, especially in the last 2 decades, in marine protection. But we remain well short of the 20% by 2020 goal. And the other thing is that coverage is very uneven. Most of the protection that the protected areas that have been established have been in the remote tropical Pacific and the Western Hawaiian Islands and so on. So one way to answer the question is that we need to cover essentially all of the other U.S. marine ecoregions. And when I say cover, I mean make sure that we have adequate representation of those kinds of ecosystems, and some larger proportion than 1%, as is currently protected in no-take zones. As Kirsten noted, the science shows that most protected areas don't actually protect much of anything because they are not sufficiently enforced, and the even light levels of fishing can have large impacts. So, in terms of geographic areas, I think we'll wait to see how the analysis comes out. But generally speaking, we need that better coverage. And the other factor that is important here is connecting the protected areas together, particularly along coastlines, as a result of the changes in abundance or changes in distribution, I should say, that are already underway with warming waters.
Thanks, Emmett. And I'd like to take the same question in the same direction with Doug and ask you. You talked about that where there's priority conservation areas in the Great Lakes, that some of the Great Lakes have achieved their targets, but other Great Lakes are missing or not quite there yet. Could you delve a little bit deeper into that question of areas that are the high-level priorities? How would you go about taking the next steps in terms of conserving the Great Lakes?
Sure, and I have to qualify this by my familiarity. I'm not all that familiar with Lake Ontario, which has the lowest level of protection. I work mostly in the upper Great Lakes, but with that in mind, there are some areas that come to my mind that represent kind of the full suite of benefits that have been described by some of the other panelists here, including they're important for biodiversity, they have important economic benefits and cultural benefits. One of those would be southern Lake Huron and the St. Clair River, where the largest remaining breeding population of Lake Sturgeon. Lake Sturgeon is an iconic species in the Great Lakes, and it was dramatically reduced. Populations were dramatically reduced by overfishing. It's recovering in some areas thanks to restoration of spawning grounds and limited fishing. Southern Lake Huron in the St. Clair River also has a lot of cultural importance related to transportation. and economic importance for the same reasons. Another area that comes to mind is Green Bay on the west side of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is also short on protected, well, actually it's nearly meeting its goal. But Green Bay has a large area of coastal wetlands and is an important spawning area for numerous Great Lakes fishes, including northern pike and smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, perch, etc. It also has an important economic aspect in terms of a source for fish for commercial fishing, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the Great Lakes. So those are a couple of areas that come to mind, but understand that there has not been an analysis such as the one that Emmett described for the Great Lakes.
Gotcha. Thanks, Doug, for sharing that, and perhaps we'll get one of those studies at some point in the future. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and come back to Vera and talk about knowledge and information. So there's the science that goes into decision making and the knowledge that people have, and I think that in the Arctic, the Inuit communities have spent a great deal of time, well, first of all, utilizing their indigenous knowledge, but also understanding what that means and how to share that information with the rest of the world. So, Vera, could you talk to us a little bit about how indigenous knowledge informs decision making, and what role is it currently playing, and what role should it play in managing the resources?
Okay, well, thank you, Kathryn. As background information, I suggest the Inuit Circumpolar Council's definition of Indigenous knowledge, or IK, and you can find this information on their ICC's website. But IK is a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It has developed over millennia, and it is developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and it has been passed on from generation to generation. So under this definition, IK goes beyond observations and ecological knowledge. It offers a very unique way of knowing that can help complete mankind's understanding of the Arctic that is valuable to inform public policy. There are definitely plenty of examples of how IK can contribute to improved management of areas and species. I offer one that I have been involved in working with the Eskimo Walrus Commission, what we call the Tribal Marine Mammal Ordinances on St. Lawrence Island. St. Lawrence Island is my home. As you may know, Pacific walrus are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we, as the Eskimo Walrus Commission, serves as a co-management partner representing Alaska Native communities. I know that Kathryn is very familiar with this term or the work. The effectiveness of co-management really varies, but I do have an example where IK changed the management of Pacific walrus. Over many years, St. Lawrence Island has contributed considerable amounts of biosamples from walrus, blubber, organs, and fluids. Our real-time observation of ice and walrus habitat, our unique knowledge of walrus and its behavior, and its description of their own traditional resource management practices to federal partners, Fish and Wildlife Service, and researchers. This is a long-standing cooperation and involvement by the communities allowed Fish and Wildlife Service to accept the tribal governance of walrus management, harvest management by the communities, which is based on safety and proper conservation practices. These ordinances work because they are specific to our culture and indigenous knowledge of the communities. These are now the starting point for our future decision-making processes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vera, for sharing that information and talking about co-management as an important way of introducing or utilizing different knowledge systems in decision making. And I might take this time to toss another question to Emmett. You've talked about the work that you're planning, and I'm wondering if you've considered different knowledge systems and how to utilize information that's not the typical peer-reviewed scientific information or knowledge levels of knowledge. How do you incorporate that into your process, and how does that affect the work that you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would answer in sort of a generic way based on our experience with the Smithsonian Marine Geo program. We especially have worked closely with communities in Hawaii and in British Columbia. Our partners in British Columbia are active with the local First Nations there. And we have, they in particular, the Hakai Institution, the institute that we work with in BC, has been starting projects that are focusing with the guardians of the coast in those areas that have been focusing on the ecology of some of the species that are of most importance to local communities, including seaweeds and herring runs and so on. So, you know, what we aim to do in our interactions in the places where we work is to essentially develop relationships and work with people in the communities that live there and who know the systems best. And as I say, we've done that most specifically in Hawaii. We had a big biodiversity inventory there a few years ago and had a wonderful reception and a celebration with some of our hosts from the local community. So that's something that we work on. We aim to incorporate wherever we work. Also in Central America, we've developed relationships with our local partners in Belize and so on. In terms of how we incorporate it, I think the most really the best way to describe it is just to make sure that we are listening to one another. We benefit from the very deep place-based knowledge that our partners have in those areas, and you know, incorporate that with what we're doing, and also come back to the communities with what we're finding out.
Great, thanks, Emmett. And several of you, I think everyone, has talked about the importance of people in the process, and clearly an element of achieving meaningful protection. I would like to turn this question back to Doug, and I know that you've been involved in a lot of processes in the Great Lakes and planning processes, and you mentioned the need for greater collaboration in the Great Lakes. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? What are are there key successes or key approaches that you've taken in planning processes or engaging with communities that maybe you can share lessons that have been learned from your experience?
Sure. Well, I've been fortunate to have been involved in several collaborative processes, and so I don't want to give the impression that collaboration does not exist in the Great Lakes. It does. I think we need to build on ongoing collaborative efforts, including, for example, the lake-wide partnerships. Each of the lakes in the Great Lakes has a binational, or in the case of Lake Michigan, a U.S. partnership that establishes objectives and science priorities and monitoring priorities, and develops a plan every 5 years. And that partnership is essential for managing the lakes effectively. There are other institutions that manage specific aspects of the Great Lakes, including the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, which has its own governance structure. Again, there are committees that are specific to each lake, and there's an overall body that manages harvest allocations on an annual basis. Those two processes, for example, the partnerships are under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The Fisheries Commission is separate. There's not a lot of collaboration there, or I would say the collaboration between those could be more effective. And so we have goals and objectives that are established somewhat independently. And the tracking of progress towards those goals and objectives is not cohesive, and the accountability is uncertain. So I think there are ways we could strengthen these governance structures and the way they collaborate in the Great Lakes that could be a benefit to Great Lakes biodiversity and people overall. I will say, though, that the people in every one of these ongoing efforts are really passionate and dedicated to doing the right thing and making good decisions.
Great. Thanks, Doug, for that feedback and sharing some of your experience. This is our final question, and I'll toss it out to Kirsten. And it's not an easy one, but a question for you to address is what do we need to change, or do we need to change our approach to how we achieve meaningful protection? We've talked about the role of community, the scientific processes that go into deciding where to protect or what to protect. How does that change, or does it change in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, great question, and certainly one that's on everyone's mind right now, I'm sure. Of course, the realities that we're facing kind of on the other side of the curve in a post-COVID world mean we're going to be seeing a lot of challenges. I think it's key that MPAs be part of the solution. There's the capacity for them to be part of the solution. It's key that working together with local communities to identify the benefits that you want to receive for an MPA should be part of the dialogue. And this connection between biodiversity, people, all the intertwined benefits and outcomes should be a key part of how we think about moving forward, how we think about the blue recovery, and how we work together towards that goal.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. And thank you to all of you for taking the time this morning to talk about the definition, or how to define meaningful protection, to give us some insight on the efforts that you have undertaken and to achieve meaningful protection, to understand the science of meaningful protection, how to engage with people. And hopefully that's provided some insight to others and will help launch a dialogue with the greater Capitol Hill Oceans Conference community.